Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode of the Kianistan podcast. First of all, apologies for the delay. We haven't had any episodes for maybe a couple of weeks now, and I apologize for that. I'm actually traveling to Pakistan with my family, and I had a lot of interviews lined up for when we get to Pakistan. But since we have been here, there's been so many floods, there's been a couple of earthquakes, there's been a volcano eruption. So with chaos going on everywhere around us. But I'm really happy for this episode today. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this episode. It's slightly off the beaten track for us. It's a topic that really interests me, but it's one of the first interviews that I'm doing in this niche. So I'm really excited. Joining us today, we have Dr. Eben Alexander. Dr. Alexander is a neurosurgeon, retired neurosurgeon, a bestseller author, and an expert on consciousness and near-death experience. So without further ado, Dr. Alexander, welcome to the podcast.
Well, Tafim, thank you so much for having me on today. It's great to be with you.
It's a pleasure all mine, and I really look forward to this. So kindly, before we get started, would you take a few moments just to tell us a bit about your background?
Well, I grew up in a scientific family. My father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. That's why I ended up going into medicine and neurosurgery. Very grateful to have a career where I could help people, especially people with such challenges. But I was trained, as many of us in the 20th century were trained in science, in materialism or physicalism, which is the notion that only the physical world exists. And therefore, you've got to somehow muster, consciousness, awareness, beliefs, thoughts, attitudes. And the mistake that the materialist scientists have made in the past was that the brain was the ultimate creator of consciousness. And therefore, their thinking was when the brain and body die, that would be the end of conscious awareness. And what they were failing to recognize is that the brain is a transceiver that gives us access to information. So that's kind of the big lesson that I've learned over time, that my near-death experience in 2008 was a profound inflection point in my life. It kind of flipped my vision 180 degrees from materialism into a far more kind of useful and truthful form of understanding reality, which puts the mind foremost. And this is where meditation and centering prayer are so important. But for me, as a formerly materialist, believing neuroscientist, it was a great revelation. And I will point out that many neurosurgeons have come to recognize the fault in pretending that the brain creates consciousness or is even the repository of memories. I mean, neurosurgeons come to realize that there's no place in the brain that you can define as being the storage place for long-term memories, which is a very important point. So my previous, existence was all about that materialism, and my NDE showed me I had it completely backwards. And now the rest of the scientific world is catching up on that reversal.
Thank you so much, Eben. Yes, I was watching some of your previous interviews, and I was so fascinated by the concept that the brain isn't an essential, it's not the only tool for consciousness. And I'd love to talk a bit more about that, and also obviously to talk about your near-death experience. Before we do that, can you tell us a bit about your religious background? Were you religious before your near-death experience? Are you a religious man now? What are your beliefs?
I think important to again point out my father's influence on me. He had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. He was overseas for more than 2 years. I still have at my bedside the little pocket Bible of the New Testament and Psalms that he had carried with him. And I believe it was his faith in God and the power of prayer that really got him through that conflict relatively unscathed. Now, like so many, kids growing up in the 60s and 70s like me, I was, taken to church and, led to believe all that. But I remember in 6th grade confirmation class in my Methodist church, having a deep discussion with my Sunday school teacher about Big Bang cosmology. I was so into physics and cosmology and all that. I knew the discussions going on in the mid-60s about the Big Bang and its importance in understanding reality. And so for me, trying to teach my teacher in that church about science. Well, I had a long way to go, obviously. And this is where, to me, it's been such a gift to be a scientist, because science is ultimately a pathway to truth. But a tremendous number of people make the mistake of thinking that, sorry, my headphone piece is messing up here, but thinking that materialist science and Newtonian determinism is really the pathway. And that's been disproven decades ago by science, as has really our kind of focus on four-dimensional space-time, as Einstein, quantum physicists, et cetera, and with acknowledgement of entanglement, which was the subject of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics, is really pointing out a mental field of the universe. That's what the entanglement phenomena is. It's about information traversing beyond space and time. So, in other words, my father was a big influence. He never wrestled with his belief in God or power of prayer. He used it in his work as a healer. For me, I had to struggle. And for much of my career, I taught neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School for more than 15 years. And much of that career, I struggled trying to understand how could conscious awareness could survive after the death of the brain and body. And that's why I needed a really deep dive. And that's what I got in my 2008 case of meningitis. It sent me into deep coma for a week. And that's what completely reversed my thinking on this. And many in the scientific community who study these kind of events have kind of looked at my near-death experience as a beautiful example of how, no, the brain is not the ultimate creator of consciousness, and that our kind of soul and spirit has an existence far beyond that. Not to dismiss that the brain isn't part of, allowing consciousness to manifest in us, but ultimately we're sharing that dream of the one mind, of that God mind. And I came to recognize in my own NDE, when I came back to this world, that it doesn't matter if you want to try and label that incredible force of love, compassion, kindness, and mercy as God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao. There are many words that we've attached to it as human beings, kind of pretending to own it and understand it. But, that force is far, far beyond our comprehension. And the best we can do is get into deep meditative states or use centering prayer, other modes of going within mind to explore, to realize we're really sharing the mind of God. And that is kind of the ultimate lesson of NDEs. And ultimately what that really means in a practical sense is we're here to show compassion, kindness, and mercy for all fellow beings without exclusion.
So true. So please do tell us a bit about what happened in 2008. What is meningitis? How did it affect you? And what was your condition?
Okay, well, important to point out that one of the atypical features of my near-death experience was amnesia. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, of this universe, of humans. It really was an empty slate. And I only realized in the weeks and months after my coma, as I was trying to make sense of it, why that amnesia was so critical. If I'd had a more standard NDE, especially one where, for example, my adoptive father, that neurosurgeon, he had passed over 4 years before my coma. And if I had scripted this whole thing, he would have been there front and center. But that's the reason he wasn't, because I also would have been more tempted to dismiss the whole thing as made up fiction in my mind. By having it removed that my spiritual guide was somebody very different, someone I didn't even know in this lifetime, but very important to me, that is a crucial piece. So given the amnesia, and don't worry, some people worry, oh my gosh, well, I have that amnesia too. I will tell you, it's very rare in NDEs. I've never heard of it to the degree I had it. And initially, when I came back to this world, I could explain that loss of memories because of the damage to my neocortex. My prior neurosurgical thinking is, well, memories are stored in the neocortex. I now know that's false. Memories are not even stored in the brain. We discuss all that in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But anyway, getting back to my story, what happened November 10th of 2008 was I woke up with severe back pain, headache, soon grand mal epileptic seizures, and I was deep in coma. I went deep into coma at home. There's a myth out there in the lay press literature on my case that it was a medically induced coma. That could not be further from the truth. And it's one of the reasons my coma is of such value and importance to the medical and scientific community, because this severe case of meningitis, and it's all the details are there in a medical case report in September 2018 Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And that case report makes two major points. One is that my meningitis was so severe that one would not expect I would have any capability to have a dream or hallucination. That's a very important point. And it's a big reason why this is far more than just a medically induced coma. And the other important thing is when the doctors who wrote the case report were challenged, how do you explain this miraculous recovery that he had? They said it's because he had a near-death experience. In other words, the big message to all of us is if we're more aware of our spiritual connections with that God force and the forces of wholeness and healing and creation in the universe, then that alignment can allow us to come into physical, mental, and emotional healing through that broad rubric of spiritual connection, knowing that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, taking advantage of prayer and meditation. These are all ways that we can all connect with a richer sense of self and who we are. Anyway, back in my story. So in this amnesic state, it starts in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. And it was like being in dirty jello. I was there for a very long time. Given my amnesia, I had no memory of anything different. So I just accepted it. Sometimes I would describe that to people and they'd say, wow, that sounds very foreboding. Wow, what a rough place to begin. I said, well, that to me was just existence, and I fully accepted it. But the good news is I didn't stay there forever. There came a slowly spinning white light, very kind of clear, kind of like ground glass appearance, fine silvery and golden tendrils. It was slowly spinning as it came towards me. And I also noticed that it had a perfect musical melody. Music, vibration, frequency are very important kind of concepts in my entire journey, and certainly in the 17 years since my coma. But this beautiful swirling light led up. It was like a wormhole or a portal up into this brilliant ultra-real gateway valley. And this is where I think some people make a mistake. They think that near-death experiences would be murky and dreamlike. The exact opposite is the case. This world, our material world, our bodies living kind of in this plodding river of Earth time, that's a very limited construct compared to the grand vision that we get in these states, in these altered states of near-death experience, shared death experience, and similar states of higher awareness. So I entered into what I call the Gateway Valley. Now, this Gateway Valley, it had many Earth-like features, but in many ways it was like Plato's world of ideals for the individual soul. It was a world of perfection, but also one where we would reunite with souls of departed loved ones, which is kind of a universal ingredient of NDEs across all cultures going back thousands of years, is that our loved ones who have left come back to us. And of course, the me before coma would have insisted that was wishful thinking, hallucination. But I know since then, of course not. These are real visitations. My own mother, my adoptive mother, had the very same thing happen when she passed from this world in April of 2019 at the age of 99. When 2 nights before she passed, she saw her own mother appear. And once I heard that from the nurses, I knew she was very close to passing. And it's not a hallucination. These are true spiritual encounters with our loved ones who are coming back to help escort us over in a beautiful fashion. And so in this Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. I had no body awareness at all. There were millions of other butterflies, like flying carpets, looping and spiraling in the skies above this beautiful meadow. The meadow was surrounded by forest with sparkling waterfalls and crystal blue pools. And there was no sign of any death or decay anywhere. This was really a world of perfection in so many ways. There were thousands of beings dancing in this meadow below me. Lots of joy and merriment. I remember seeing children playing and dogs jumping. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, I said these were souls between lives. But the amazing thing was witnessing this incredible festival of joy and reunion that was going on here. And the best part about it was I wasn't alone on that butterfly wing. Witnessing all of this with me was a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She never said a word to me. She never had to. But her emotional truth came to me in this mind meld where we basically had this overlap of awareness and the message to me, which I had to put into words later because it was pure conceptual flow when it was delivered. But when I put it into words weeks later, I said, the message was, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And you can do no wrong. That was a statement that to me made tremendous sense. But unfortunately, in the book Proof of Heaven, I wish I dressed it out more because it's people read that and they think, oh, you mean you can do anything? Really? Of course not. The reality is in that realm with the beauty and the light and the love, what you do is you go through life reviews. You go through the events of your life from the perspective of everyone involved. And what you learn is in a life review, whatever you dished out to others, if it was a lot of love and compassion, wonderful. That's what comes back to you. If it was pain and suffering, that's what comes back to you. So in other words, the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the very fabric of the universe through these life reviews. Now, given my amnesia for Eben Alexander's life, I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, but I saw life reviews as I ascended to higher and higher levels in a very powerful, generic sense. And the way that unfolded was in this beautiful realm that I was in, the Gateway Valley, with this lovely girl on the butterfly wing giving me an incredible reassurance. That's when I felt this soft summer breeze blow through, and I many a time have talked about how that breeze to me was like the breath of God, divine wind. It was my first awareness in that amnesic state of the incredible power, majesty, and yet personal beauty and spiritual home of that God force. The God force that I came to see as I ascended to higher levels beyond this Gateway Valley was really the origin of my own conscious awareness. So in other words, none of us are ever separate from God. Our very awareness is absolutely linked at this fundamental level with a co-creative force of pure love, unconditional love. I often call it the love of the creator for the creation. And of course, that's not going to ignore any parts of the creation. So this beautiful sense of oneness and love, and it in many ways, as I mentioned before, doesn't matter what we want to label that force, because NDEs point out that we're all really talking about the same loving force together. That's the origin of our conscious awareness. So at any rate, in my journey from this Gateway Valley, what happened next was I witnessed all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down. I could kind of sense this material world beneath it. But important to point out that that spiritual realm is a realm of eternity. That's why people can have life reviews where you have birth, death, everything in between, and it's all simultaneously presented to you. And in fact, in many of these stories, you hear of people who have past life memories that contribute to the issues involved in this life, and they even see potentials of where future lives may offer the opportunity for growth, transformation, evolution of consciousness itself. So this notion of earth time is not, it's part of consciousness, and it's part of superficial consciousness. It's not even the part of that God mind, but we can get there through prayer and meditation, through having an NDE, witnessing these events of our lives, making amends to others. I mean, all these are parts of what we're here to do as spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. And when I use that word spiritual, I simply mean it's an acknowledgement of our interconnection through that mental space, both with other minds, like telepathy is something that science has shown to be quite real. 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. So telepathy is one example of kind of this non-local consciousness that we share. But also in NDEs, you come to find this great concept of unification of mind in that God mind, kind of the mind of the universe. But ultimately, the important thing about it all is love, compassion, kindness. I mean, NDEers, no matter how much they try and explain their journeys, right at the core of it all is this beautiful sense of love and connection that is all inclusive for our fellow beings. And it's often said that they come back more spiritual, but less religious. But that depends. Religion can be a very powerful and wonderful tool to help people get into this oneness relationship with God. But what I would encourage people to do is personal experience, centering prayer and meditation. So not just a reliance on Scripture, although Scripture can indicate certain directions and themes and all that. But ultimately, I think the best connection is a personal one. And that's why I greatly encourage people prayer and meditation. For anyone who needs assistance with that, sacredacoustics.com is a powerful tool. We can get into all that later. But the bottom line is, in my journey, I ascended to this next highest level, which I call the core. And that's where I saw all of that spiritual realm. And it's kind of, time or temporal things that were much grander because they weren't limited by earth time. And that's where you start to realize that this discussion of coming back again, because reincarnation is not just a religious concept, it's been scientifically studied. People who want to know more can go to uvadops.org, University of Virginia Vision and Perceptual Studies, and learn a whole lot more about many cases of reincarnation. Sorry?
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. Thank you so much for that very detailed kind of description of your experience. It's given me so many questions that we can go through throughout this interview. But just for my audience as well, my audience would probably be from various different backgrounds: Muslims, non-Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, or people of no faith at all. I myself, just for transparency, I'm from an Islamic background. And we have a very clear kind of a description of exactly what afterlife will be. My purpose right now for this interview isn't to kind of have a theological debate. It's actually, I'm here as like an open vessel. I'm actually interested in your experiences, what you personally have gained out of it. And there will be certain areas that we will agree with, certain areas we will disagree with. But I think it's important, first of all, to be respectful and to not dismiss anyone's experiences offhand. I think we should always engage intellectually, but also on a human level with people who may have different experiences and beliefs than we do. And I think it's always, we learn so much from each other. I doubt it's just kind of I thought might be useful for people listening. But some of the questions that came to my mind even was like, first of all, so you experienced so much in that experience, but in reality, how long were you unconscious for?
I was in coma for 7 days. And
wow, that's a long time.
It was really the seventh day that I was coming out of it. And my doctors estimated I started that week with about a 10% chance of survival. By the end of the week, I was down to a 2% chance of survival, but no chance of recovery. And that's why the doctors recommended on day 7 that they take me off the ventilator, take me off the 3 powerful antibiotics I'd been on, and just let me go. Wow. And that was... Sorry?
Even also, as I was preparing for this interview, I read that there have been some people from scientific background who have criticized some of the things that you've written about. Amongst them, apparently, are Sam Harris. Viewers might be familiar with his name, Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks is a big name. And apparently the criticism that they had was that medically induced coma is not the same as brain death. But what you just said, if I'm not wrong, is that you didn't have medically induced coma. Is that right?
That is correct. In fact, Dr. Bruce Grayson who studied my case and has studied these kind of cases as a skeptical psychiatrist for more than 45 years. In his autobiographical book, it's called After. And in that book, he devotes his chapter 10 entirely to my case. And he makes it clear. He's the one who reviewed over 2 years. He reviewed more than 600 pages of my medical records. And he says that I went into coma before anybody gave me any kind of sedation at all. And when I came out of coma on day 7, I was still under very heavy sedation, which they had me on to because of the presenting initially with seizures. And so that was to help to make sure I didn't have seizures again. But Grayson made it very clear this was not a medically induced coma at all. And that's why their statement, too, when they were challenged by the peer review editors of the journal, how do you explain this miraculous recovery? They said very clearly, it's because he had a near-death experience. Do not dismiss, as a scientist, the importance of these kind of spiritual events that lead to, miraculous, inexplicable healing. And they knew of other cases like that. Dr. Mary C. Neal, an orthopedic surgeon, had an over 30-minute warm water drowning in Chile, kayaking in 1999, and was brought to the surface dead, and yet she ended up having a full recovery. Hers was a very Christian NDE, but you have other types of NDEs that lead to the same thing, like Anita Morjani, who was Hindu and had a beautiful near-death experience, the same kind of focus on love and healing and wholeness. And to me, that's why it's so important. We don't try and limit this to various religious beliefs, but realize this is all about our innate spirituality as human beings, as sentient creatures. We have this connection with that God mind, with each other, with shared meaning and purpose, and also this shared mental space. And that's where I think it's important for us to grow together and not use religious ideologies to drive us apart. But when you study NDEs in large numbers across all cultures, you realize there are a lot of similarities in things that kind of lead to a universal understanding of humanity and what it's like to be a human in a body, but then to have that body come to an end. It's not the end of the conscious awareness of the soul. That's the important thing to get.
Even also, so you're a neurosurgeon, you're a man of science. How do you define near death? Is there a definition for it, or is it like is it a case by case thing?
Well, it's the near-death experience basically has a few ingredients, and sometimes you don't even have to be that near death for it to happen. People can even be in what's called a fear death situation, say a car crash or a plane crash, where they walk away relatively unscathed, but they can have a powerful set of experiences that are potentially, end of life, even if their life doesn't end there and then. But near death, to me, is merely kind of it's a blurring of the normal kind of concrete walls between us and our spiritual selves and the spiritual world that allows us to glimpse beyond the veil. And the interesting thing is you have not only near-death experiences, which can happen in people with all different modes of almost dying and brain damage, meningitis, head injuries, there's a whole huge category of them, but you also have a similar but different group that are called shared death experience. Shared death have a lot of the same ingredients of near death, but they happen in perfectly healthy people. Often they can happen in a medical practitioner who's helping somebody who's almost dying, and the medical practitioner's soul can actually be taken along on the journey. More commonly, they involve a loved one, family member. It can happen thousands of miles away. These are not limited by, distance and time and space. And the shared death experience is especially fascinating because these are generally very healthy people. And for their soul to be taken along by the departing soul, even to the point of witnessing a full-blown life review of that departing soul before the bystander soul comes back to this world. There are an amazing category of experiences that completely dismiss the materialist pseudo-explanation that NDEs are due to decreasing oxygen tension in the brain, increased CO2 levels, what have you, all these explanations that never really held much water anyway. But with shared death, you can throw them all out the window because shared death clearly shows us We're talking more about spiritual capabilities of human beings, especially with the extreme situation of a soul leaving its body. That often can create an incredibly rich ground for people to come to deeper understanding of their relationship with the universe and with God and with this kind of eternity of soul.
That's amazing. I had never heard of shared death. I'm going to look more into that. So thank you for enlightening us with that.
Shared Crossing, I think William Peters from the Shared Crossing Project has a website that I would highly recommend. And he goes into a lot of detail about shared death experiences and what they are, and reports many, many cases. And in fact, his whole Shared Crossing Project is to help people who are, family members with somebody who's dying in their family to increase their chances of having a shared death experience with them. So check out Shared Crossing Project.
Okay. And also, so I'm imagining that, like, when you had your experience and you came out of it probably took you some time to make sense of what happened. Or did you come, when you came to, was it all crystal clear what just happened to you, or did it take time to interpret what just happened?
I will tell you, almost 17 years later, I'm still unpacking it all. So,
Wow.
yeah, these things change your lives incredibly, but it doesn't mean you instantly understand everything. You might instantly understand that you had it all wrong before, but in terms of understanding how it all works, that it's just a catalyst that allows us to get into that. And that's what my life has been like. And it was an incredible seesaw initially, because you got to remember that when I first woke up from coma, my meningitis was still very active. The brain damage was still very much there, even though I was on a rapid path to recovery. But when I first woke up, my family, of course, was elated because the doctors had said I wasn't going to wake up. But then they realized that my brain was very avid. And I describe it all in the book, Proof of Heaven. But I went through about a 36-hour period after awaking from coma, after they pulled out the breathing tube and took me off the ventilator, where I was interacting with family and friends. Initially, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sons, my sisters. Right there at the bedside, I had no idea who they were. That amnesia was still so powerful. All I knew was the incredible spiritual journey I'd just been on, which, of course, is the subject of many of my talks in the book, Proof of Heaven. But it was very confusing initially. And I also had an ICU psychosis. A kind of a nightmarish set of experiences. And I knew when they were happening that it was a delusion. I knew it wasn't real. Very different from the deep spiritual experience, deep in coma, which was absolutely real and sharp and crystal clear. And those details I can remember sharply today, as if the whole thing just happened yesterday. Whereas that 36 hours of after extubation, after awakening from coma, in and out of kind of craziness, as memories were coming back and my brain was recovering from that, from the meningitis. I mean, that was a crazy time, but I knew that it was delusion. And I'm glad I wrote everything down as much as I did by the encouragement of my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. And he knew every time you revisit a memory, you change it. So he's the one who told me, write everything down before you read anybody else's near-death experience. That was very important. I'd never really paid attention to that literature before, but you can bet now, after having one, I wanted to read everything I could. He said, don't do that. Write down your experience first so it won't be tainted by anyone else's. And I'm glad I had that 20,000 words I wrote over about 6 weeks. But during those weeks and months after coma, I was kind of going up and down, because initially when I then started reading the NDE literature, I realized there was so much overlap with what I've been through. And I could tell in reading so much more comes through than just the words as they are on the page. The gestalt of the story comes through and how it transforms somebody. And that's where I was finding this incredible kinship. But also I was finding that the spiritual guide that was very common was usually somebody very important to you in this lifetime. And I knew that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing so clearly because of our mind meld. And yet I also knew I'd never known that person in my life. And to me, that was very, very confusing. And also, like I said, if I had scripted the whole thing, my adoptive father would have been there front and center. and yet he was nowhere to be found. So I was up and down all over the place in terms of trying to interpret this. I wanted to tell the stories to my doctors, but they said you can forget about it. The dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So my first assumption before my neurosurgical knowledge came back, which took about 2 months, was, okay, so it was a gigantic hallucination, but wow, what an incredible thing. I've got to write this all down because it's bound to be telling us something about consciousness and the brain and mind. But the more I got into it, the more I was just hitting a brick wall. And that's why in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, I tell the story of how 2.5 years after coma, doing a deep meditation using sacred acoustics type binaural beat brainwave entrainment, where I can get very deep into this meditative state, I did encounter the soul of my adoptive father. And in one moment of recognition and acknowledgement from him, I realized that the reason he could not be apparent to me, as he put it in the NDE, was in spite of the 1 in 10 million diagnosis, E. coli meningitis in an adult, in spite of a 1 in a billion recovery, if my adoptive father had been there, I would have been a little tempted as a skeptic to just say, oh, you just see who you want to see on the way out. And that's why my NDE had to go multiple levels deeper. It involved the amnesia. It involved the identity of that beautiful girl in the butterfly wing. And there I will reveal that a huge part of my story is that I was adopted. My birth mother was 16 years old, unwed, and there was no way she could keep me, but she was also unwilling to sign the papers to let me go. So even though social services took me over at age 11 days, I couldn't get adopted out till I was over 4 months old. And that's because she wouldn't sign the papers. So I got stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months. Now, I'm not looking for sympathy because I was adopted into a wonderful family that honored all my hopes and dreams. But the reality is that crater of being abandoned by my mother at age 11 days was part of my subconscious doubt in my why I should even exist, or was I even worthy of love? And that was where a very affirmative answer came through the near-death experience in 2008. Yes, of course I was. And but the adoption history is very important in the story. For those who've read Proof of Heaven, they'll realize that I reached out again to find my birth mother in the year 2000. And that was because of a project, school project, my older son, Eben, the fourth, was doing in school. And he needed more information on our biological heritage. And that's where I sent a letter to the children's home expecting to get the same answer I'd always gotten. Your birth mother's not looking for you, so forget about it. Well, that's not the answer I got. Driving through a blizzard in February 2000 to take my older son skiing up in Maine, I remembered, oh yeah, the social worker said call her today. Maybe she'd have an answer to my inquiry about my birth mother. And I called the social worker and she said, well, I do have an answer. Are you sitting down? Well, I was driving a car through a blizzard, but I was sitting down. She said, your birth parents got married. I cannot tell you what a shocker that was. At age 54, I found out that my birth parents got married. Not only that, they had 3 children. So I had a full family out there, a full biological family that I'd never known about. But then she said, your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That would have been in 1998. And because of their loss, and they're still grieving that loss, it's not a good time to come back in their lives. And I went into a dark night of the soul. I didn't realize it, but I spent the next 7 years. I stopped saying prayers with my sons at night. I stopped taking them to church. I lost all my own personal belief in a loving personal God and power of prayer. I really kind of gave up on it. And I think that dark night of the soul is an important ingredient because you really need to kind of doubt and then gain proof that helps you kind of build your worldview. And that's exactly what happened to me through this whole process of the NDE and been making sense of it in the 17 years since that time. But a huge part of it had to do with that adoption story and discovering the identity of that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing, which came to me as a photo in the mail 4 months after my coma. And I don't want to spoil the book Proof of Heaven for people because that's how that book finally comes together, is with that recognition and acknowledgement. But from then on, once I recognized who that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing was, everything fell into line and made perfect sense. And that includes my kind of awareness of her, my emotional engagement that had happened whenever I talked about her in public presentations.
Are you fully recovered, by the way, from your meningitis?
I'm sorry,
Are you fully recovered from your medical?
Yeah, I just say within about 2 months, I was fully recovered. I did go through physical therapy. I had some asymmetry in my motor function coordination. Uh, the memories, interestingly enough, by the time they all returned after about 2 months, I found through close discussions with family and friends that some of the memories were more complete than they had been before coma. That's a real shocker. But again, we talk about all that in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, how memories are not even stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist uh, neuroscience, and yet it's a fact that neurosurgeons have kind of slowly gotten to over more than a century of brain operations. And I refer to the work of Wilder Penfield, a very renowned Canadian neurosurgeon, very respected, who wrote a book in 1975 called The Mystery of the Mind, where he made it clear that in spite of his decades of work as a neurosurgeon stimulating the brain in awake patients, so he's right at the core of brain and its interaction with phenomenal experience. And I've done a lot of those operations myself, wake craniotomies when people have tumors or vascular lesions near the speech cortex or near motor systems. We have to be very careful. Sometimes do the operation with the patient sedated for the opening, but then awake while we do the brain operation because the brain feels no pain at all. So anyway, there's a big literature on that, but I would say that the scientific community is going through a radical kind of renaissance at this time, which in many ways is interesting because the deepest truths they're uncovering in brain-mind connection and the deepest understanding of the scientific nature of reality refers back to some of the greatest successes of spiritual leaders for thousands of years. Acknowledging the oneness of our connection, that's oneness through a creative force at the core of the universe, and that it's all about the binding force of love, compassion, kindness, mercy. These deep kind of scientific truths are emerging from the study of NDEs, but ultimately reflect the messages of the greatest prophets of history that have given us of our various religious systems. Once we realize that human beings have a tendency to use religious systems for their own means, but if we go back to the pure message of the prophets, we can find this kind of love, acceptance, mercy, kindness, a universal, unconditional love to be right at the core of some of those greatest teachings. And that's what the scientific study of NDEs and consciousness in the modern era is also leading us to that very beautiful, promising, kind of optimistic and harmonious future for humanity.
Eben, so you're an expert in this field, and I can imagine that you must have gone through so many studies. First of all, can you recommend anything, similar studies for people who had similar experiences from a Muslim background? Do you have anything like that?
Well, what I can tell you, I mean, I had my own beautiful experience of Karen and I were visiting in Morocco back in December of last year, that is of 2024. We had a beautiful 2-week journey in Morocco. We gave talks at multiple places. We met a lot of people. Of course, most of them were Muslim, and it was I remember one gentleman sharing his very powerful NDE with me, and he was sharing it because he said it shared a lot of similarities with my own journey. And so, when you hear those kind of things personally from other people, that's what has the greatest impact. I think it turns out, though, that in the Islamic literature, NDEs might not be as commonly reported as they are in some other faiths. And yet, for example, there's a beautiful book by Azmina Suleiman, I believe, in 2004, something like Passage to Eternity. But she had a very profound and intriguing near-death experience. And she discusses it, from her Islamic perspective. So I can send people. That's a beautiful resource that Diane Corcoran, who used to work at International Association of Near-Death Studies, recommended. So there's certainly a literature there that's very rich with this. It's interesting that I would say that near-death experiences, the content is something that is independent of one's prior religious beliefs, although one can use their prior religious beliefs to interpret, analyze, and kind of convey But the interesting thing, like for me, growing up in a Methodist church with a fairly conventional Christian upbringing, there was never any talk of true oneness with God, oneness with the divine. And yet that is something I experienced completely in my NDE and also have experienced in meditation, in deep meditation. I mean, I feel it walking, in the woods in nature. I mean, in a very natural setting all the time now, because I've been meditating an hour or two a day the last 12 or 13 years. So and there's also a resource I can recommend. It's called The Essence of Religions. It's a book by Christopher Koppes, Coppes, Koppes. He's Dutch. The book is out in English, certainly, as well as in Dutch. And that Essence of Religions, he basically takes the 5 major religions of the world today, the 3 Abrahamic faiths, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, as well as Hindu and Buddhism, and he compares them all to near-death experiences. And he basically treats NDEs as the gold standard. Because NDEs probably are far more efficient and effective at delivering the golden rule as a concrete message about the nature of our existence. But he does a very good job of comparing religions and basically shows how they all do something of a good job, but you can see how they also all kind of fall a little bit short of giving the big, deep, pure message of love and compassion and kindness that comes out of near-death experience literature. But it's certainly there and comes from all religious faiths. In fact, you often find people who have no religious faith. They're agnostic or atheist, and yet they have a profound spiritual experience like this, and they come back just knowing in the reality of that God. They don't have to put it into any kind of scriptural or ideological, formal religious context, but through personal experience. And for me, personal experience is especially important. And this is why I encourage people, you don't have to have your own NDE to know everything I know about this. Develop a rigorous program of regular meditation, of centering prayer, ways of going within, connecting with that God force on a very personal basis. My father had that very easily. And yet he was born in 1913 and never given all this other information that we've had in the late 20th and early 21st century. That's summarized, for example, in our book, Living the Mindful Universe, and also as another resource I would suggest for people who want scientific evidence of the afterlife, BigelowInstitute.org. Go to BigelowInstitute.org, and you will find 29 essays that were written 4 years ago. And they're very powerful essays from many different scientific directions, all pointing to the reality of the afterlife, the eternity of soul. And for the scientifically minded, I would highly recommend BigelowInstitute.org.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Also, I'm just wondering, so different people from different backgrounds, different ethnic, geographical, religious backgrounds have had NDEs. And I'm guessing that obviously a lot of things will be quite unique to their own experience. But what are the things that you think are common? Like, for example, in your experience, you saw butterflies, lights, music. What are the things that you think in your studies are kind of variables, and what are the things that are consistent amongst the different people that have this experience?
Well, I will refer to the work of Gregory Shushan. He's written extensively on near-death experiences in ancient cultures, in primitive cultures. And I think that can be very illustrative because it helps to move us beyond, any kind of cultural expectations in the modern era, and just to take that raw data. And what he says is the most common feature across all cultures is that loved ones who have left the physical plane come back to welcome us over. And as I said earlier, the me before coma would have been, as a materialist, would have insisted that's wishful thinking. But I've heard so many stories. Many are stories where the person didn't even know that the other soul that they saw had died. But that's the commonality of these experiences. So I'd say that is first and foremost one of the most incredible elements, is a connection with loved ones who've left the physical body. There's also a sense often of ascent, of traversal, of ascending from darkness into light, of entering an altered realm and an altered kind of state of consciousness, and also this incredible sense of love. of compassion. I can tell you a lot of people, I'm convinced, that were attracted to the book Proof of Heaven, read it because it reminded them, there was something about the language and about the nature of the journey I described that reminded them of something in their own memory that was deeply buried, but they could recover memories of something in their own existence. And it aligned very much with the story I was telling. So these are very common stories. And yet in our culture, especially in our materialist Western culture, they get very suppressed. Materialists saying, oh, no, that's nonsense. That's woo woo. We know that's stupidity of you to even believe that, ignorance. Well, no, because if you read the BigelowInstitute.org essays, you'll realize very quickly the ignorant position is materialist science. The emerging scientific position that has great evidence supporting it is one of a universal mind. Evolutionary panentheism is probably a good philosophical term for it, but that the God force is in all that is, and that we have tremendous power as sentient beings with our connection with the divine to manifest the world of our dreams. But ultimately, as life reviews show us very clearly, that kind of coming to fruition involves the higher good. It involves bringing that love of God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Great Spirit, bringing that love, serving as a conduit and sharing it with our fellow beings. We're here to help. We're here to help the least, the last, and the lost. And this includes certainly in our modern era of warfare and of persecution and violence, refugees. Taking care of these people is absolutely critical for anyone who claims to have this kind of soulful connection with God, with this God force at the core of the universe. So it really is an antidote to the false kind of materialist sense of separation. That we're separate beings, separate entities. And that kind of thinking in the 20th century came bundled with a false interpretation of Darwinian evolution, that in fact, survival of the fittest, competition were the keys to success. Well, any modern biologist will tell you biological systems succeed through collaboration and cooperation, both between members of the species and between species. Like when you see dolphins serving as midwives for the birthing of whale pups, this is all kind of an amazing acknowledgement of the oneness we have with nature, with the universe, with our fellow sentient beings, and that we're really here to take care of each other. That's the love of the Creator for the creation that is all inclusive. And this is really where I'd say the study of NDEs and consciousness as revealed through these extraordinary human experiences can be so powerful. But again, all that you need is to seek that connection on your own, centering prayer and meditation. Very important, but also, of course, living what is revealed to us in these beautiful meditations and prayers through that God force of unification and love. That's what we then must live. And I'd say that, especially when you study scientifically life reviews, and that scientific study, for example, is from Bruce Grayson, and he published in fall of 2021 in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, a summary of almost 700 life reviews. And to me, the more important things, about a third of those people said their entire life was involved. No event was omitted. And you might say, how does that happen during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? And it's because in that realm, you're absolutely in eternity, in a timeless realm. And so, it's easy to understand when you acknowledge the power of these experiences. Most importantly, in Bruce Grayson's reporting about life reviews, is that more than 3/4 of these people say that the life review is from the perspective of everyone involved. That is critical. That is where the golden rule is written into the fabric of the universe. Because if you've handed out pain and suffering to others, in 3/4 of life reviews, you'll be feeling that coming back on you. And it is teaching you not to treat people in that way. In many ways, you can kind of look at that realm as neutral, because, it's simply showing you that if you treat others like that, it's not good. It doesn't feel good. So let's do better than that. But important because this acknowledges how we're all truly in this together. I often say we're sharing the dream of the one mind, and we have this responsibility that comes from this, that's not there in the false sense of separation of materialism, but a responsibility as sentient beings, as souls with an eternal existence that have a responsibility to our fellow souls and how it contributes to the growth of higher consciousness at large. All this is important. And that's why this kind of revolution I'm talking about, I think, is a very important ingredient to even saving humanity from itself. Because a lot of that false sense of separation in the modern era, especially with the greed of capitalism and, say, corporate energy companies and scientists who know better, who know that carbon dioxide heats the planet, but they prostitute themselves and say, no, the science doesn't support that, but the science does. The more that corporate greed and the mighty dollar dominate things, the more danger we're in as human beings. We need to come back to more of a spiritual awareness where we're truly here to help each other and emphasize the importance of kind of the success of our fellow spiritual beings in achieving that oneness with the divine, with this shared love, compassion, and kindness for our fellow beings.
Eben, thank you so much. I mean, the things you talk about, prayer, love, compassion, mercy, these things are so important, and they've never been as important as they are today in the material world that we're living in, where there's so much cruelty going on around us. On our podcast, we talk a lot about geopolitics. We look at the situation in Gaza and Ukraine and in Sudan, all of these places where right in front of us on a daily basis, we see so much cruelty and so much suppression going on. And in a time of abundance where we see people starving around us, it's so important to remember the things that you're talking about and to kind of use these things to elevate us beyond the material and beyond the immediate. So I do thank you for that. Also, can you, in closing, also tell us a little bit more about your books? Because your books have been huge bestsellers on New York Times list and all sorts of other publication lists.
Well, certainly. You can go to Eben, EBEN Alexander.com to learn a lot more about all of this. That includes all the books beginning with Proof of Heaven. Proof of Heaven really kind of blew the world apart in terms of NDEs. It was on the New York Times bestseller list as the nonfiction title in first position for more than 42 weeks.
I hugely appreciate that. Thank you so much.